Yoga.
Welcome to the Institute for Personal Development, Kriya Yoga Ashram, where total consciousness is the new frontier.
Kriya Yoga is union of the individual with the divine. Join us as we explore the practices to initiate this process.
Good morning. Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. Let's talk consciousness. I am your hostess, Lisa Winton, and with me is Kenny Toy, also known as Swami Jayananda, founder of the Institute for Personal Development, located here in Hampton, New Hampshire. Good morning, Swami. Thank you for being here today. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing pretty good today. How about you?
Well, I'm doing great today, too. Thanks for asking. And we'd like to thank you all for tuning in. Today in the Voice of Yoga, we will talk about the difference between the whisperings of mortal imagination and divine inspiration. Listen as we explore the idea of sowing to the flesh versus sowing to the spirit by distinguishing metaphysics from divine metaphysics. In this episode, we will explain the term spiritualization and why Mrs. Eddy wrote, "You can't put an infinite mind in a finite form." Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. We are talking consciousness. Join the Kriya Yoga Spiritual Advance to get the light in your soul and live with spiritual influence. Swami, the title of today's podcast is Recognizing the Influence of Truth. Can you tell us what inspired you to set up this podcast topic?
This was inspired by you reading Joel Goldsmith's Beyond Words and Thoughts. You came up with how we can start to understand a little bit more about the process in development. Where we could start today is with what is meant by spiritualization. To grasp the idea of the term, it's valuable to understand we don't make anything spiritual. Instead, belief in everything unlike spirit is dissolved. Spirit is the only reality, the only substance, light, life in all creation, and it's everywhere always, eternally perfect. The thing we have to start to understand is we cannot perceive it with the mind we're using to get us through this lifetime. And so how do we receive divine inspiration? And how would I know the difference between the whisperings of the mortal mind, world mind influencing my thought, and if I was receiving divine revelation?
That's a good question, Swami. So how would we know the difference between the two? What are some of the things we look for?
Well, what we have been saying is spirit is whole, it's complete. God wouldn't be talking to us in mental material terms. So we would have to have a better way of understanding how the absolute is trying to communicate to the finite. As we start to unbox this topic, it's important to build a mental landscape that will support the divine idea. In truth, God would not be talking to a finite mortal being, primarily because God knows nothing about this mental material concept, this illusion that we think we are. To help us understand it, let's go back to what Joel Goldsmith said, what inspired you for this title for today's show. This is from Beyond Words and Thoughts by Joel Goldsmith, and I'll ask you to read it.
Furthermore, God is not something that can be used. Man has always tried to make of God a servant. Dear God, take care of my rent next month. Dear God, make my digestive apparatus work. Dear God, protect my child. God is thought of as a servant doing man's will, but there is no such God. You cannot make God do your will. You cannot influence God, not by praying, not by being good, not by fasting, not by tithing. You cannot influence God unless you can see that you are not coming anywhere near the experience. Once, however, you have come to the realization, I cannot influence God, I cannot get God to do my will, you can settle down in peace and quiet and say, well, God, maybe you can influence me. That would be a twist. Then you will understand what the mystics mean when they write that you must surrender yourself to God, that you must yield yourself to God, and why Jesus could say, nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. It is foolish to have a will of your own, even a will to see your friends healed, even a will to see peace on earth. Do not have any will at all, but retire within as many times a day as you can. Find a minute to remember, nevertheless, Father, not my will, but thine be done on earth as it is in heaven. Relax and rest, and be a beholder of what God's will is. It might even include peace on earth if you only could let that will of God come through, instead of treating him as if he were some kind of a servant that you were going to direct. End of the passage. So we have a lot of here that we can talk about. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, in order to really begin to understand this, you have to start with the principle, know God aright. The Orthodox religious concept of God that rewards and punishes won't work in this paradigm, primarily because you would not have a principle. God is running a perfect universe. Nothing ever has to be added to it or taken away. What we're looking at is not the divine creation. God can't give us anything, primarily because God is not withholding anything. The finished kingdom is everywhere always. It's the only reality. Like Joel said here, we're looking for the God experience. What is the God experience? It is when the human becomes conscious of the divine creation, which is the only reality everywhere always.
So I like one of the phrases that he says, you cannot influence God. It reminded me from the Bible, that passage that says, ye pray amiss. So I think that's very telling for us. We don't pray for something. So that's why we pray amiss, and we're trying to influence God. What do you think about that?
Yeah, again, it's all part of how we've been socialized and how we misunderstand Scripture with the influence that we get from Orthodox religion, which completely misses the message of the Christ and has lost touch with the intention of religion in general, this idea of relinking. We have to be taught how to separate from being influenced by the world mind and rejoin with the invisible, intangible, divine omnipresence. And there's an evidence procedure that accompanies that. But without leadership, we're pretty much left to our own devices here, trying to figure out how the unreal became real rather than having some good leadership in how to relink the individual with the truth of being, the divine creation. And so I recommend always is developing a mental landscape that will support the divine idea. Something that when you put the pieces together, they all fit. The minute we have this will of our own, personal sense, human will, we're in the trap. We have to know that we must give that up before we can shift our identity from mental material to spiritual. And then what is that going to look like when I'm doing it? Because it's very easy to think you're spiritual when you are still working with this mental material concept that isn't capable of knowing this truth that we're talking about.
I like what he says, well, God, maybe you can influence me. And then from what you were just saying, it sounds like we have to be at a different level of consciousness to even allow this divine influence to enter us and change how we think.
Right. What we have been talking about, Mary Baker Eddy said in miscellaneous writings in a chapter called The Way, mortal mind must undergo 3 stages of development. You're absolutely right. If we don't initiate this developmental process on a mental material level, then how are we going to be able to receive divine revelation if we don't understand what it means to be born of spirit? And what is that going to look like when I've separated from being influenced by the world mind? So this is why we talk about what's the difference between mortal imagination and divine inspiration, because we use the term intuition. Well, intuition is a human intellectual function. We have 4 mental functions that we could develop: perception, reason, memory, and intuition. But this would make us psychic, but not spiritual. Once we have mastered the mind-body complex and we know ourselves in the way that we are known, which is spirit, then the process continues where you walk reason through the open door of revelation. But it's a process. It's not typically an event. Even say, for example, when Jesus said, "And I, if I be lifted up, I draw all men unto me." Very important to understand what he means by the term man. The Bible talks about these stages in development when it says born of woman, born of man, born of spirit. It's caterpillar, chrysalis, butterfly. And man means that you have graduated, you've separated from your lowest level of consciousness, animal magnetism, and you are developing human intelligence. It's just like when the tide comes in, it doesn't lift all the boats, it lifts all the floating boats. If you're a sunk ship, then the tide comes in and it goes out, but it doesn't affect you because you're anchored on the bottom.
So I like that term, spiritualize. It reminds me of what Joel Goldsmith had said. We talked about this in another show about nothing eyes, everything. Is there a way, or should we even spiritualize everything that is around us, what we see, what we hear? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, the function of spirit is what we would refer to as the dissolving force of the universe. In material law, there's a creating, a sustaining, and a dissolving force. Spirit is continuously dissolving. It is translating everything back to itself. Remember, spirit is one, incorporeal, perfect, whole, complete. And so the idea of spiritualization is exactly that. It's translating everything back to the one substance, the creative principle of the universe.
So maybe you have a practical application of what you're just talking about. I'm curious to know, so say we see 2 people arguing on the street or a child crying. Is there a way that we can spiritualize what we think that we're seeing so we're not caught up into this mortal picture that we're viewing?
Yeah, as you start to advance in this idea of spiritualization, you're translating everything back to its original substance. There's only one life here, and it's the life of God. It's perfect, it's complete, whole. What we're looking at is a human concept about it. It's dualistic, it's an appearance, it's a thought, and so you treat it differently. You want to pierce through the appearance and be a faithful witness to this divine creation, invisible, intangible to your corporeal senses. Now, once we understand what we're looking at is not the divine creation, that might influence your desire to develop the faculty that will enable you to perceive what really is there. And that's the process. We must be born again of spirit. We must learn how to master the modes of mortal thinking. And then this idea of the transfiguration. which is the process when we unlink the form from mental material to spiritual. And then this birth of Christ in consciousness, Christ being the eternal principle, which is what makes the divine creation comprehensive to human consciousness. Without the birth of Christ in consciousness, there's no way of us developing the mind of Christ. But then, like we said in the opening, you can't put an infinite mind in a finite form. So we have to learn how to resolve the physical form into a mental image, then capable of receiving divine revelation. So it's pretty extensive and complicated, but with instruction, you'll find that it's doable.
We're going to pause right here to hear a word from our sponsor. Listeners, we'll be back with you in just a few moments. Institute for Personal Development Incorporated is a Kriya Yoga ashram offering yoga classes in all 8 stages of Kriya Yoga, including classes, personal training, teacher training, residential program, online live classes, and online products for self-discovery and transformation. Discover, learn, and practice one of the oldest and purest forms of yoga, Kriya Yoga, by uniting ancient religion with modern science. Visit www.ipdtransform.com. Namaste. Welcome back. For those who are just joining us, you're listening to The Voice of Yoga, and we are talking consciousness. So I have another curiosity about what we had read about Joel Goldsmith when he says, it is foolish to have a will of your own. So my curiosity is, how can we go through our life without having a will of our own and let divine will direct our path?
Yeah, as you advance in this and you understand the idea of putting off the old man, you can't put new wine in an old bottle. You can't put an infinite mind in a finite form. You can't be personal and infinite and impersonal at the same time. And so as we advance in this, we start to see I want will always obscure I am. And so at some point we have to understand that I can't be both. I can't be a finite mortal being and the immortal spiritual self. But what you'll learn is that it's really not a sacrifice to give up this personal sense of self in order to be in tandem with the perfection of being. There isn't anything we could do humanly that would ever match the perfection of the divine principle functioning everywhere always. So we surrender this false sense of self and we let divine mind take over the scientific government of this false sense of self. And what's interesting is when you do that, you will start to see accepting and living in the knowledge of the immortal self takes care of what seems to be a finite, mortal sense of self. And so there's value in this, not my will, but thy will. If you do things with human will and personal sense, it can be done for good or for bad because you're under karmic law, which is the belief in 2 powers. But when things are done under the government of divine law, there's only one power, and it's absolute goodness. Now, to help expand on this, we have something here from a paper called Healing by Martha Wilcox. This will give us a better understanding of the why. Why would I want to give up this personal sense of self? And then also delve into a little bit of the how to. How do I go from sense to soul? So would you read that for us?
Sure. There is the prevalent belief that fear and anger disturb digestion, that hate is a deadly poison, and that the thought can generate lesions. And this has been mistakenly said to agree with the teachings of Christian Science. but all such beliefs are sin and are untrue. Mrs. Eddy says, such theories have no relationship to Christian Science, which rests on the conception of God as the only life, substance, and intelligence, and excludes the human mind as a spiritual factor in the healing work. That's Science and Health, page 185. If we accept the belief that all sin, disease, tragedies, and calamities are caused by rebellion, hate, resentment, worry, doubt, and fear, then we must accept the belief of a material creation governed by a mind capable of evil thinking. But this is all contrary to the teachings of Christian Science. Emotional disturbances such as rebellion, resistance, worry, hate, or fear have no power in and of themselves and cannot, therefore, cause bodily derangements or diseases. Emotionalism belongs to mortal mind, which Mrs. Eddy teaches is never substantive, but is illusion, is ignorance only, is the false representation of man. It is most necessary to study our textbook with an understanding mind. On page 411, we read, the procuring cause and foundation of all sickness is fear, ignorance, or sin to the unenlightened thought. This might imply that mortal mind does cause disease, but this reference from our textbook is not a statement of fact, but is the analysis of sickness as mental and physical. On page 419, we find the opposite statement. Neither disease itself, sin, nor fear has the power to cause disease or a relapse. And on page 415 we read, a mortal mind is the only cause, and therefore disease is neither a cause nor an effect. Evils must be disposed of scientifically. We do not experience sin and disease, we sense them in belief. The same as we sense a green horse while viewing a white horse through green glasses. Likewise, we sense perfect creation, man and the universe, as matter deformed, diseased, insufficient, or dead, because we see through the lens of material sense. The imperfections we sense are no more conditions to be eradicated or removed from perfect creation than greenness was a condition to be eradicated or removed from the white horse. Unless we perceive that creation is perfect and spiritual now, we have no principle to demonstrate and no rule for its demonstration. You'll recognize that from Miscellany, page 242. End of this passage. Swami, we have a lot to talk about here. What are some of your insights?
Yeah, for me, it was a little bit of a shock to find out that this entire human experience was an illusion. Until you have this willingness to challenge what it is we're doing, you will remain in the belief this is real. The entire medical model is trying to figure out how the unreal became real. We're going about it 180 degrees from the way that it is designed to work. I love what Mary Baker Eddy said in a paper called Principle and Practice, where she says mortal mind is belief and divine mind is understanding. We believe we are a finite mortal being. We believe in sickness, suffering, disease, lack, and limitation. It is our belief in this sense level of awareness, however, that creates a veil and prevents us from knowing the truth being that God is running a perfect universe. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. We don't make ourselves spiritual. We come out of a belief in a finite, temporary sense of existence. And then I really like what Martha Wilcox gave us as far as the how-to. It's as simple as removing the mind that is creating the illusion. How do we do that? Well, initially, you have to learn how to control how you think, and then be able to think differently. Stop thinking with 5 corporeal senses and start knowing with 7 spiritual senses. So cultivate and develop the faculty that enables us to perceive the divine creation. You can start with a belief in the divine creation. You can be a faithful witness to the divine creation without knowing the truth. What Jesus said to Thomas, you believe because you see. How about all of them that believe that do not see? Your belief in the divine creation will begin to demonstrate. How we think is what we become. The problem oftentimes is we don't know the difference between mortal imagination and divine inspiration. And so we can follow our intuitions. We can follow these messages we think we're getting from God, which are really coming from world mind. There's a difference between being psychic and being spiritual. To be spiritual, you must be a faithful witness to the divine creation. To be psychic, you believe in your visions. You believe in these whispering words that are telling you what they want you to do. In order for us to graduate from sense to soul, however, we have to know the truth. And you can't know the truth with the mind we're using to get us through this lifetime.
Yeah, and I like what she says at the very end. Unless we perceive that creation is perfect and spiritual now, we have no principle to demonstrate and no rule for its demonstration. So we really do have to change how we think about what we see and hear around us.
Yeah, and when you drill down with that, the principle is the allness of the divine creation, the perfection of being. The rule is oneness. You can't be a finite mortal being and be able to be that place where divine truth will express itself through you. It functions in what we call the physics of spirituality. Like attracts like. And the big difference between metaphysics and divine metaphysics is this understanding of oneness. Metaphysics means mind-body. Divine metaphysics means divine mind and one body. It's a whole different paradigm that you work with. When you understand oneness and like attracts like, you can see a mortal being, which is not real, but an appearance, a concept about the divine truth, cannot draw divine truth into its awareness. And so to graduate from sense to soul, the idea of to think differently becomes the methodology by which one develops the faculty to perceive the divine creation. We do this by initially unlinking the form from the lower mortal mind, then relinking it to the higher mortal mind. The 3 stages of growth the mortal mind goes through before reason can walk through the open door of revelation. And it all begins by being born again of spirit. When matter and mind come together with the invisible, intangible, divine omnipresence, and we remain a faithful witness to the divine creation, in spite of the testimony of the 5 corporeal senses, and we do this by practicing, piercing through the testimony of the corporeal senses on a regular basis, so that we're no longer fooled by the counterfeit sense of life, and we rest in the knowledge that in spite of what is appearing in my senses, I trust the divine principle is functioning everywhere, always.
Swami, thank you for your insights for today's podcast, Recognizing the Influence of Truth. Listeners, be sure to visit the website www.ipdtransform.com. On any of the pages as you scroll down, you'll see several buttons there that you could press to further your understanding. Swami, any final thoughts about today's program?
Well, I would like to encourage people to join the Kriya Yoga Spiritual Advance to get the light in your soul and live with spiritual influence. Namaste.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, The Voice of Yoga. This is Lisa Winton along with Swami Jayananda signing off. Have a wonderful Kriya Yoga realization. Namaste.